This morning we're going to continue our series on evangelism and apologetics. For those of you who have not been with us for the past 3 or 4 months, this is our 18th session of 19. So if this is your first time, you're getting the very tail end of this series. What we're going to do this morning is continue listening to what's been titled The Great Debate. Does God exist? The most important question that can ever be asked and answered. And this is a debate that occurred in 1985 at the University of Southern California, Irvine, between Dr. Gordon Stein and Dr. Greg Bonson. Please, as I said, 1985. So you were about 10 years old then. Yeah. Actually, I was 10 years old then.
Last night was the anniversary. It was on March 28th.
Really?
Yes, I read that over some site.
Wow. So this is timely. Please have your pen and paper ready to jot down questions and comments that arise in your minds as you're listening to it, because afterwards I'll entertain those. We're going to resume listening where we left off last week. We'll start out with rebuttals, I believe. Anybody print off the transcript okay, very good. I tried to send to everyone an email in which was the web link where you can download the full transcript of the debate. It's very good. So each debater at this point in this debate has finished his 15-minute opening remarks. Before we start, before Matt starts it for us, I want to remind you to keep your ears open and tuned to some of the things that we have covered in this series on evangelism and apologetics. In particular, keep in mind the checklist for arguing with unbelievers. If you recall, if you have your binders with your notes from the prior sessions, in sessions 13 and 14, we covered 4 points of a checklist for arguing with unbelievers. And then also 2 broad steps to comparing opposing worldviews, the worldview of Christianity and that of the unbeliever. And remember, those 4 points of the checklist were to be on the lookout for prejudicial conjecture. When arguing with unbelievers, you'll hear comments made that are born out of a prejudice that they have against Christianity and for their own religion, whatever that may be, atheism, Islam, Buddhism. Second, you want to point out the unargued philosophical bias or grid of presuppositions from which your unbelieving neighbor is arguing and has taken for granted. And you're going to see this in the debate, or hear it in the debate. Third, you're going to show the dialectical tensions or incongruous presuppositions within the philosophy of the unbeliever. In other words, you're going to point out the incoherence of his worldview. Remember, my homespun illustration of that is that he has socks in his underwear drawer. All unbelieving philosophies or systems of thought fall prey to that. And you're going to see Dr. Bonson, I think, very eloquently point out that if you're an atheist and you show up for a debate with, that your worldview is false, because atheism destroys the preconditions for the intelligibility of logic. All debates, all discourse requires laws of logic, and I'll not steal the thunder of Dr. Bonson, but that's one of the things that he focuses on. The fourth thing that you'll want to look out for in your own dialogues and see in this debate is the failure of the unbeliever's worldview to provide the preconditions not only for logic, but for understanding or making sense out of any aspect of human experience, whether it be logic or love or morals or induction. In other words, you're going to show the pagan, as I think Dr. Bonson does, that his most basic assumptions about the world, how men can know what they know, and how they should behave in this world are lacking. And then the 2 broad steps to comparing opposing worldviews to stir up your minds by way of remembrance are to perform an internal critique of the unbeliever's worldview, which is what Bonson's doing. He's stepping into the pagan system of thought and breaking up his furniture, or as Angie, I think, pointed out one time, showing that the furniture upon which he's building his arguments against God is stolen from God's house, which is, of course, very offensive to the Lord. And then secondly, set forth the Christian worldview as the context for dealing with the unbeliever's objections to Christianity. Second, the precondition for the intelligibility of human experience. And then lastly, the Christian worldview is the only basis for conflict resolution and redemption. And that's where the cross is the center of apologetics. And any apologetic method that doesn't have the cross there is, in my humble opinion, unfaithful to the Scriptures. So with that, we'll begin with a brief word of prayer and ask the Lord to bless our time. Our Heavenly Father, we do pray that you will help us this morning to think about and to understand some weighty matters. We know that you care as much for our bodies as for what we often look at as spiritual things. Some of us here are weak and sick this morning, perhaps weighed down by emotional trauma that they've experienced this week. Please help us to set those things aside for a while as we listen to this debate and attempt to glean from it how we may better defend the truth that you have entrusted to us in your word. We so love you and praise you that we desire to live in accordance to your law. We know that is only because of the work of your Spirit in our hearts. And I pray that if anyone is here who is estranged from your grace, that you would stoop to grant to them repentance from their sin and saving faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. It'll take a few seconds to get the volume fixed.
Honestly reported having had such experiences. But the feeling of having met God must not be confused with the fact of having met him. This is a confusion, a semantic. Also, we cannot use our own feelings as if they were valid information about the world. They are feelings that we have inside of us, but you cannot demonstrate them to another person. They cannot be used as evidence. If everyone had that same experience, now, the argument for religious experience, many people have claimed to have had a personal experience or encounter with God, therefore we must exist. Now, this is a difficult one to handle because, first of all, I've never had such an experience, but I'm sure people have absolutely honestly reported having had such experiences. But the feeling of having met God must not be confused with the fact of having met him. This is a confusion, a semantic confusion, and also we cannot use our own feelings as if they were valid information about the world. They are feelings that we have inside of us, but you cannot demonstrate them to another person. They cannot be used as evidence. If everyone had that same experience, like if we all looked around the room and we all agreed there was a clock over there, then we might say that the vision of a clock was a consensual one, that everyone agreed on it. Other than that, if you saw a clock and nobody else did, or only 2 or 3 people did in the room, we would have a bit of a problem. Pascal's wager is the last of 11 arguments. I hear this a lot on the campuses. It says, since we don't know whether a God exists or not, we have no way of finding out in this life. We have nothing to lose by believing in a God. On the other hand, we have a lot to lose if we do not believe in a God, and therefore later turns out to be one after we're dead. Well, this is only true if, number one, you're right about a God, and secondly, if you have picked the right religion, because you might wind up at the judgment day and be right about a God, but he says, what religion were you? And you say, I was of Islam, believer in Islam. And he said, sorry, Catholicism is the right religion, down you go. So, in addition, we might also have, if we have a God who punishes people who live virtuous lives, let's say an atheist who lived virtuous life, did wonderful deeds in the world, but just did not believe in a God. If the God punishes him, then we have an irrational God who's just as likely to punish the believer as the unbeliever.
So this is where we finished last time.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. We will now move to our period of cross-examination. The first cross-examiner will be Dr. Bonson, who will have an opportunity to cross-examine Dr. Stein. If I could please have silence, we would appreciate it.
Stein, do you have any sources that you can give to us very briefly that define atheism as one who finds the theistic truths inadequate rather than one who denies the existence of God?
Yes, sir. George Smith's book, which you will find for sale on the back of the room upstairs later, called Atheism, The Case Against God, which I think is the finest book ever written on the subject, makes this quite explicit. I happen to have a copy right here. I can quote you the exact words if you'd like
No,
to
that
see
won't
them.
be necessary.
Okay.
Do you have any other sources?
Do I have any other
Do you have any
sources?
other sources?
Sure.
What would they be?
Charles Bradlaugh, who I will give them to you right now. 100 years ago, Charles Bradlaugh made the comment in his plea for atheism. He said,
That'll be fine.
okay, well,
Dr. Stein, did you hear Dr. Bonson use the following argument? The Bible says that God exists, and the Bible is the inspired word of God, therefore what it says must be true, therefore God exists.
he did not use that and just assume that that was so because she was quoting from the Bible as if it
I
proved the
didn't ask
existence
you
of
what I
God.
assumed, I asked you if I used that argument.
No, you did not use the argument, but you used the results of the argument.
Dr. Stein, you mentioned 11 basic proofs for the existence of God. Did you mention the transcendental proof for the existence of God?
No, I didn't mention it by name. I think it is not a proof. I would not call it a proof. As I understand it from what you said.
Rebuttal on that point. In other words,
Okay.
you didn't deal with that particular one. Are all factual questions answered in the very same way?
No, they are not. They're answered by the use of certain methods, though, that are the same. Reason, logic, and presenting evidence.
Right. I heard you mention logical binds and logical self-contradictions in your speech.
Mm-hmm.
You did say that?
I use that phrase, yes.
Do you believe there are laws of logic then?
Absolutely.
Are they universal?
They're agreed upon by human beings. They aren't laws that exist out in nature. They
Are
are
they simply conventions then?
they're conventions, but they're conventions that are self-verifying.
Are they sociological laws or laws of thought?
They are laws of thought which are interpreted by men and promulgated by men.
Are they material in nature?
How can a law be material?
That's the question I'm going to ask you.
I would say no.
Dr. Stein, now you have an opportunity to cross-examine Dr. Bonson.
Dr. Bonson, would you call God material or immaterial?
Immaterial.
What is something that's immaterial?
Something not extended in space.
Can you give me an example of anything other than God that's immaterial?
Laws of logic.
Can I ask that you hold that down, please?
Are you putting God in the same, as an equivalent thing to the laws of logic?
No, only if you think all factual questions are answered in the very same way would you even assume that by thinking there are two immaterial things, they must be identical. No,
No, I'm not assuming that. I'm just assuming that because the laws of logic are a convention among men, are you saying that God is a convention among
I
men?
don't accept the fact that laws
Okay.
that claim the laws of logic are conventional.
Okay. Is your God omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent?
He is.
You don't find this a contradiction at all?
I do not.
Okay, well, we'll show you a little later that it is. If your arguments in favor of the existence of God are shown to be incorrect, will you relinquish your belief in God?
If my arguments are disproven,
Yes.
will I relinquish my belief in God? If there are no arguments for the existence of God, I wouldn't believe in God.
That's not quite answering the question. If someone can show you that there are no arguments, would you relinquish your belief? I'm trying to see what's the
But
basis
you're the
for
one
your
who
belief.
said that it's impossible to show a universal negative. No one can show that there are no arguments for the existence of God, so we can only deal with those that I know of.
Okay, if someone showed that all of the ones that you produced were invalid, what would be your position?
Well, you'd have to describe further the conditions of this. Rationally speaking, if there is no basis for belief in the existence of God, I would relinquish that belief.
Okay, is God good?
Yes, he is.
How do you know that?
He saved me.
He created me. He made the world and he made it good. He sent his son into the world to die for my sins. Many of these evidences are quite convincing to me, but I don't use them outside of the worldview in which they make sense, in which they would be taken as true. If you mean, is God good in such a way, or can I give you evidence that you would accept, that would depend on what your presuppositions are.
No, I'm asking, if God says something, anything, is it right because anything God does is good, because God is good, or does it become good just because God said it? I don't know if I said that right. I guess I did.
Now, I understand the problem, so it's roughly stated. What God says to be good is good because it reflects his own character. God is good and is the standard of goodness. That's one of the presuppositions of the Christian worldview.
Isn't it indeed a presupposition which is presupposed before there is any actual data from God?
Is this a question about my first opening statement?
In a sense it is, because although it isn't directly mentioned in your opening statement, it has to do with the whole idea of whether there are absolutes outside of God.
This is the end of the first track.
I still think we're straining at the limits of debate rules here, but I will answer your question. There are no absolutes outside of God.
So in other words, the fact that God is good is something that God told you, and that's why you accept it, rather than knowing it ahead and assuming it as a presupposition, which you said a minute ago.
That's extremely simplistic. God told it to me, and he provided evidence of it.
But you also said it was a presupposition.
That's right.
Isn't that a contradiction?
No, not at all. There are many things which are presupposed as well as evidence in this world. For instance, the laws of logic.
I would disagree with that, but okay. All right, still have some time. All right. When we talk about immaterial things, are you also saying that there's such a thing as, let's say, ghosts or the soul, which are another example of immaterial things? Would you call them immaterial?
I would say that man is a living soul and has an immaterial aspect to his being, yes.
Mm-hmm. And how would you prove this?
This has to do with the existence of God now?
Well, it has to do with the existence of immaterial things.
Well, if there's an immaterial being, God, and if the Bible is his word, then I would say that his revealing the nature of man in the Bible is sufficient proof. And that takes us back logically, as you'll be bound to say, to whether God himself does exist. And that's what we're supposed to be debating.
Okay, so you're giving me a circular argument, which is...
So I'm telling you what the debate is about.
Well, I know what the debate is about.
Yeah.
I'm asking for an answer to a question and I didn't get one. Oh,
I'm not debating the nature of the soul tonight, but the existence of God. Yes, I believe the man has a soul.
Okay, the only reason I asked about the soul is because this is a simpler immaterial object that most people would hold is also immaterial.
Well, I would say that it's similar. I mean, that's your claim.
Oh, simpler, I said, not similar.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, having concluded our segment of cross-examination, we will now begin final rebuttals for segment number 1. Dr. Bonson, I now turn to you for an 8-minute rebuttal.
Thank you. Dr. Stein is not into this debate yet tonight. We are debating the nature of, the existence of God. I specified that I would be speaking in order to avoid logical contradiction of one particular view of God, the Christian view of God, which I personally hold. Dr. Stein says that he will not restrict himself to the Christian conception of God. Well, that's fine, he may not, but all the time he uses on anything that's not the Christian conception of God will be irrelevant. In fact, I will join him in refuting those other conceptions of God. The existence of God that I'm arguing tonight is the Christian one. Secondly, when Dr. Stein defines an atheist as one who finds the theistic proofs inadequate, that is unproven but not disproven, he's engaging in linguistic revision. He does quote for us, of course, he said that he could, and I trust that he can, to atheists who likewise define atheism that way. But you see, that strikes me as similar to a Christian who defines his position as being true at the outset, and therefore it must be true because it's true by definition. He has minimized the task that is before him by simply saying, I'm here to show that the theistic proofs are inadequate. Well, you see, even at that, though, he didn't do his job, even though that was less than what he really should be doing. Because he gave us 11 basic proofs for God, attributing one to me that I didn't use and do not use, and did not assume. He mentioned 11 basic proofs, but did not deal with the one that I gave in my opening presentation. And so he has not dealt yet with the argument that is before us this evening. Dr. Stein has mentioned logical binds and logical self-contradictions. He says that he holds that the laws of logic are universal, but, however, they are conventional in nature. That is not at all acceptable philosophically. If the laws of logic are conventional in nature, then you might have different societies that use different laws of logic. It might be appropriate in some society to say both my car is in the parking lot and it's not the case that my car is in the parking lot. That is, certain societies that have a convention that says, go ahead and contradict yourself. But there are, in a sense, subgroups within our own society that might think that way. Thieves have a tendency to say, this is not my wallet, but it's not the case that it's not my wallet. They might engage in contradictions like that, but I don't think any of us would want to accept this. The laws of logic are not conventional or not sociological. I would say the laws of logic have a transcendental necessity about them. They are universal, they are invariant, and they are not material in nature. And if they are not that, then I'd like to know in an atheist universe how it's possible to have laws in the first place, and secondly, how it's possible to justify those laws. The laws of logic, you see, are abstract. As abstract entities, which is the appropriate philosophical term, not spiritual entities, as Dr. Stein is speaking of, as abstract entities, that is to say, non-individual or universal in character, they are not materialistic. As universal, they are not experienced to be true. There may be experiences whereby the laws of logic are used, but no one has universal experience. No one has tried every possible instance of a law of logic. As invariant, they don't fit into what most materialists would tell us about the constantly changing nature of the world. And so you see, we have a real problem on our hands. Dr. Stein wants to use the laws of logic tonight. I maintain in so doing he's borrowing my worldview. For you see, within the theistic worldview, laws of logic make sense. Within the theistic worldview, there can be abstract, universal, invariant entities, such as the laws of logic. Within the theistic worldview, you cannot contradict yourself, because if so do, you engage in the nature of lying, and that's contrary to the character of God as we perceive it. And so the laws of logic are something that Dr. Stein's going to have to explain as an atheist, or else relinquish using them. The transcendental argument for the existence of God, then, which Dr. Stein has yet to touch, and which I don't believe he can surmount, is that without the existence of God, it's impossible to prove anything. And that's because in the atheistic world, you cannot justify and cannot account for laws in general. Laws of thought in particular, laws of nature, cannot account for the human mind and the fact that it's more than electrochemical complexes and events, and cannot give us moral absolutes. That is to say, in the atheist conception of the world, there's really no reason to debate. Because in the end, as Dr. Stein has said, all these laws are conventional. All these laws are not really law-like in their nature. They're just, well, if you're an atheist and a materialist, you'd have to say they're just something that happens inside the brain. But you see, what happens inside your brain is not the same as what happens inside my brain, and so what happens inside of your brain is not a law. It doesn't necessarily correspond to what happens in mine. In fact, it can't be identical with what is inside of my mind or brain, because we don't have the same brain. If the laws of logic come down to being materialistic entities, then they no longer have their law-like character. If they are only social conventions, then, of course, what we might do tonight to win the debate is just define a new set of laws, and we'll say all those who want the convention that says atheism must be true, or theism must be true, and we have the following laws, which we conventionally adopt to prove it, you see, we'll be satisfied. But no one is satisfied. That's not a rational procedure to follow. The laws of logic cannot be avoided. The laws of logic cannot be accounted for in the materialistic universe. Therefore, the laws of logic are one of many evidences that without God, you can't prove anything at all.
Thank you, Dr. Bonson. Dr. Stein, your 8-minute rebuttal, please.
Okay, I'll now touch on transcendental evidence, the existence of God, which is, I think, the only time I could really do such is in my rebuttal. But first I'd like to do one more important thing. Rather than asking what is the cause of the universe, we must first ask, does the universe require a causal explanation? Rather than asking what is responsible for design in nature, we must ask, does nature exhibit design? God is given as a solution to a metaphysical problem, but no consideration is given to whether such a problem exists in the first place. But God is not an explanation for anything. For example, if I ask you, how did the universe come? And you say, God created it. That doesn't answer the question. The question is, how did God create it? And I defy any theist to explain how God created it. Basically, what you're saying is that an unknowable being is responsible for a given phenomenon which he caused through unknowable means. And that's not an explanation, but rather a concession that the phenomenon is totally inexplicable. Now, about the laws of science. An atheist world, first of all, I don't think that Dr. Bonson understands what a scientific law is. A scientific law is an observation that's made over and over and over again. The law of gravitation, we drop objects all over the world in different situations, and we always observe that they fall to the earth. So eventually we make a statistical statement that objects are likely, almost 100% likely, to fall to the earth if they're not accelerating in the opposite direction. Okay? In other words, a rocket doesn't fall to the earth immediately, but eventually will if it doesn't escape the gravity of the earth. So these scientific laws are merely consensuses based on thousands and hundreds of thousands of observations. The laws of logic are also consensuses based on observations. The fact that they can predict something correctly shows us that we're on the right track, that we're corresponding to reality in some way. If I can plug in a formula and show exactly where a cannonball is going to land and predict exactly where it will strike, then my mathematics is reflecting something valid about the behavior of cannonballs that are fired on this earth. Otherwise, I wouldn't have picked the exact spot. And mathematics is basically logic, again, used in the same way by consensus of tested things that are self-verifying. I'm not explaining it as well as I could, but that's basically what I'm saying. And an atheist universe then goes on the basis of the fact that matter has certain intrinsic behavior patterns. Electrons repel each other because they're both negatively charged. Protons repel each other. An electron and a proton attract each other. The opposite poles of a magnet do that. That's an inherent property of matter. That is what produces the regularity in the universe. If there were no regularity, then there would be no science possible because you couldn't predict anything. Matter wouldn't behave the same the second time as it did the first time, or the third, or the fourth. So the lack of having a God is in no way detrimental to logic and to having laws in an atheist universe. In fact, if we had a God, we could very easily have an irrational God who did things capriciously, so that if I threw a ball, one time I threw it, it would go up, and the next time down, and crash straight down and soar right up. That would be just as much evidence for a God as a regularly behaving ball or object drop. I mean, you could have a God who makes the rules and changes them from time to time, or we could have one that makes things the same, or we could have a universe that just behaves that way normally. Now, to ask what caused the universe, although we didn't get into this exact thing, I'm trying to show you that it's to ask an absurd question in the first place, to give God as the answer. First of all, I mentioned it doesn't explain anything, but secondly, before something can act as a cause, it must first exist. That is, it must be a part of the universe. And the universe sets the foundation for a causal explanation, but it cannot itself require a causal explanation. I don't know if that's clear. If I say every human being had a mother, that's a valid question. But if I ask who was the mother of the human race, that is a non-valid question because the human race didn't have a mother. I can ask what was the cause of this planet exploding, but to ask what was the cause of the universe is to ask an invalid question. And to offer the answer as God is to offer an invalid answer to an invalid question. We
haven't gotten into morality. I think I'm going to leave that for the second half. If Dr. Bonson doesn't raise it, I will. He makes an awful lot of statements that are basically feelings. He felt God entered his life. He felt that this happened. He felt that Jesus was resurrected. If he were held to the historian's standard, especially the standard required when a miracle is done, as David Hume said, when a miraculous or very unlikely event, such as the resurrection, although Hume didn't use that exact analogy, that exact example, occurs, we must demand an extraordinary amount of proof. If I say that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, we don't need too much proof because it's rising every day. If I say the sun is not going to rise tomorrow, then we need an extraordinary amount of evidence before someone will take that seriously because it's an unusual event. Okay? Now, he has not held up the historian's standard to a lot of the things he's accepting from the Bible as evidence for God. And I think that if he did so, he would soon see that those evidences dried up. Now, to get to transcendental evidence, finally. The statement that if God did not exist, we couldn't prove anything, and that logic and scientific laws would be invalid is absolute nonsense, and I think I've demonstrated part of that. He says that laws of logic are the same everywhere. This is not true, although they are mostly the same. And I wonder if he's ever heard of a Zen koan. And the answer to a Zen koan is something which, like, now, what is the sound of one hand clapping is the most famous Zen koan. The answer to that kind of a question is in a different type of logic, in a sense, or it's extra logical, if you want to call it that. But I do think that most logic, as we accept it in the Western world and most of the Eastern world, is basis of agreement on people that reflect something about the universe. The idea that transcendental evidence of the existence of God is that the impossibility of the opposite, that the world view would not be rational if it were atheistic, is total nonsense. And I've demonstrated to you that it depends on the inherent properties of matter. If matter has the properties where it behaves regularly, then we have order in the universe, and we have a logical, rational universe without a God. The God issue is not germane if matter behaves in a regular way. And I would hold that the properties of matter, as demonstrated over and over again, are regular. And it's an inherent property of matter. So I think that the transcendental evidence statement can be dismissed as mere wishful thinking coupled with misinformation about what scientific laws are and what atheists would hold. In fact, science itself is atheistic. Science is not allowed to use a supernatural explanation for anything. And there's a very good reason for that. If your experiment came out one way, you could say God did it. If it came out the opposite way, you could say God did that. You would never make any progress in explaining anything in science, and so the agreed-upon consensus for rules of science is that naturalistic explanations only are asked for and allowed.
Okay, we have concluded segment number 1 of this evening's debate. We will now enter segment number 2 of this evening's debate. Dr. Stein will open segment number 2 with a 10-minute opening statement.
He will if he can find his notes. Now, it would be logically wrong to say that if all of the proofs fail for the existence of God, that one is justified in saying that there is no God. There's a logical fallacy, argumentum ad ignorantum, or something like that, to say that you accept something just because all the evidence to the contrary fails. However, we have two other factors here that we must consider. One of them is the fact that 900 years have passed since Anselm first postulated the ontological proof, and Thomas Aquinas in 1200 or so. So we have a long period of time in which all these proofs that are being professed fail. That's some evidence about probability of there being a proof that someone will come up with that will succeed, being pretty unlikely. In addition, we have a number of things which I wouldn't call proofs, but I would call evidence, which make the existence of God even more improbable. And one of them is the problem of evil. If an all-good God exists, why is there evil in the world? We are told with God that all things are possible. If all things are possible, it would be possible for him to create a world in which the vast mass of suffering that is morally pointless, such as the pain and misery of animals, the cancer and blindness of little children, the humiliations of senility and insanity, were avoided. These are apparently inflictions of the Creator himself, or else we have a God that isn't omnipotent.
If you admit that, then you deny his goodness. If you say that he would not have done otherwise, you deny with him things that are possible, all things that are possible. So the atheist can present several arguments which sort of increase the probability that there isn't a God. They're not proofs, as I said. One of them would be the problem of evil. The idea is that the presence of evil is incompatible with an all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful God, as Dr. Bonson suggested he believes in. Now, he could come up with a statement that injustice in this world may well be corrected in the next world, but that would be something that he would be making without any evidence whatsoever. Just, again, wishful thinking. He could also say that, get out of this bind by saying that God is not all-powerful, that some things, some evil things are done without his permission, so to speak. In which case his statement that he believes in an omnipotent God is falsified. He could also say that the old argument about free will, which is basically a morass into which he may fall if he wishes, will not do. To say that God gave man free will and therefore he can choose between the evil and good is to imply that God was unable to make a man who could examine both sides and always choose the good. That, in other words, he's limited, and the only way he can do it is to let man completely choose for himself, as if that would take something away from man if he could examine both sides and still have the guidance within himself to always choose the good. Now, there's no obvious physical evidence of a God. If God wanted man to believe in him, man or woman, people, he could, all he have to do is put in an appearance before a group of people, especially a group of atheists. In fact, we invite him to our meetings to put in an appearance. And that way anyone would believe in him except a fool. Well, the Christian says that this may sound logical to you, but it doesn't to God. God evidently wants man to believe on faith without adequate evidence. Well, if he does, then why did he give man the power of reason? And why did he give man more reason than any other animal has? If all living things on the earth were created by a God, and he was a loving God who made man in his own image, how do you explain the fact that he must have created the tapeworm, the malaria parasite, tetanus germs, polio, ticks, mosquitoes, cockroaches, and fleas? Now, surely the dog is not suffering from original sin and needs to be infected with fleas so that he can get to doggy heaven, which will be better than his present life. The standard answer of theists to this kind of question is things have to be better after death. You know, we have these things on earth, it's a vale of tears, so to speak. Doesn't make much sense. I mean, any God that would punish a man for what his ancestors did is not a very moral God. I'm talking about original sin now, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. There are many instances on the earth in which no distinction seems to be made between the innocent and the guilty, between the Christian and the non-believer, for example, in natural disasters like an earthquake or a fire. It kills Christians, it kills babies, it kills animals, it kills non-Christians. You certainly can't say that these people were punished in some way for something that they did. It also demolishes churches and hospitals without distinction. Isn't this evidence that at the very least, whatever force there is controlling these things doesn't care if people are Christians or not, or whether they're innocent or not? If there's only one God and he cares at all how he's worshipped, why are there so many different conceptions of God and so many different religions, all claiming to be the one true religion? Does this mean that they're all mistaken? Does it mean that one is correct and all the others are mistaken? There's an old joke about an atheist in which he said to a believer, you know, you believe that 99 of the 100 gods are false. I just go one step further and say that the 100th one is also false. So I'm sure that Dr. Bonson, in fact, he even agreed that he would help me refute any other gods but the Christian God. If Christianity is the one true religion, why are so many people who sincerely believe in it found in prisons, slums, and in organized crime? I'm not saying that all people there are Christians. I'm not saying that all people in organized crime are Christians either. But it evidently, if Christianity led to an elevation of moral standards, which we haven't gotten into yet about morality, but I'm going to jump the gun here a little bit. Christians would be expected to be highly moral, not less moral. In fact, studies of the religious beliefs of prisoners have shown that almost all were devout Christians. The number of atheists is less than 1%. And these statistics were in fact so disturbing to the people who conducted them that they stopped collecting them recently. Can't argue with the facts, though. Any system which seems to fail in its application as frequently as Christianity does is not a very good or practical system for mankind to follow. I don't want to get into a real discussion of Christianity, except that Dr. Bonson insists that the Christian God and Jesus and the other evidences that come from the Christian God, concomitants with them, are true and the others are not. What are we left with after this exercise? Well, we can see that we can't prove the existence of God by any rational or logical process, and Dr. Bonson has not offered us any. We have a factual issue here. Again, as I said, because the proofs fail, it doesn't mean that the existence is disproved, but I think it certainly is unproved. We can, as I will say in my closing statement, this does not leave us in a bleak and horrible world. There are many, many things that the atheist does with his life which make this world a nice place and enable him to get to the solving of the problems of this world instead of hoping for pie in the sky, which does not seem to be very probable.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. Dr. Bonson, can we please have your 10-minute opening statement?
You've heard Dr. Stein refer to the transcendental argument and try to dismiss it simply as wishful thinking. If our debate is going to degenerate to that level, then I dismiss everything that he has said as wishful thinking and delusion, and why don't we all go home? No, we're here to argue. We're here to argue a point, and I'm going to say just what the argument that has been proposed and see if Dr. Stein has any better answer than just to engage in name-calling. Dr. Stein proposes an atheist worldview. I propose a Christian theistic worldview. There are other proposals out there that may want their evening to debate as well. I'm maintaining that the proof of the Christian worldview is that the denial of it leads to irrationality. That is, without the Christian God, you cannot prove anything. As one illustration of that, although I want to get into more than that in the second speech, I have referred to the laws of logic. An atheist universe cannot account for the laws of logic. Dr. Stein, interestingly, in responding to that, spoke more about scientific law than he did about the laws of logic, and I'm going to come back to that in my rebuttal to ask about his understanding of scientific law. However, we still hear him saying that laws of logic are a matter of consensus and are just this way. That is to say, I don't have to prove that the laws of logic exist or that they are justified. It's just this way. Now, friends, how would you like it if I would have conducted the debate in that fashion this evening? God exists because it's just that way. You just can't avoid it. You see, that's not debate, that's not argument, and it's not rational. And therefore we have, interestingly, an illustration in our very debate tonight that atheists cannot sustain a rational approach to this question. What are the laws of logic, Dr. Stein, and how are they justified? We still have to answer that question from a materialist standpoint. From a Christian standpoint, we have an answer, obviously. They reflect the thinking of God. They are, if you will, a reflection of the way God thinks and expects us to think. But if you don't take that approach and want to justify the laws of logic in some a priori fashion that is apart from experience, sometimes that suggests when he says these things are self-verified, then we can ask why the laws of logic are universal, unchanging, and invariant truths. Why they, in fact, apply repeatedly in the realm of contingent experience. Dr. Stein told you, well, we use the laws of logic because we can make accurate predictions using them. Well, as a matter of fact, that doesn't come anywhere close to discussing the vast majority of the laws of logic. That isn't the way they are proven. It's very difficult to conduct experiments on the laws of logic of that sort. They are more conceptual in nature rather than empirical or predicting certain outcome in empirical experience. But even if you want to try to
justify all of them in that way, we have to ask, why is it that they apply repeatedly in a contingent realm of experience? Why, in a world that is random, not subject to personal order, as I believe Christian God, why is it that the laws of logic continue to have that success-generating feature about them? Why should they be assumed to have anything to do with the realm of history? Or why should reasoning about history or science or empirical experience have these laws of thought imposed upon it? Once again, we have to come back to this really unacceptable idea that they're conventional. If they are conventional, then of course there ought to be just numerous approaches to scholarship everywhere, different approaches to history, to science, and so forth, because people just adopt different laws of logic. That just isn't the way scholarship proceeds, and if anybody thinks that is adequate, then they just need to go to the library and read a bit more. The laws of logic are not treated as conventions. To say that they are merely conventions is simply to say, I haven't got an answer. Now, if you want to justify logical truths along a posteriori lines, that is, rather than arguing that they're self-evident, but rather arguing that there's evidence for them that we can find in experience or by observation, that, of course, was used, by the way, by John Stuart Mill. People will say we gain confidence in the laws of logic through repeated experience, and that experience is generalized. In some weaker moments, I think Dr. Stein was trying to say that. Of course, some of the suggested logical truths, it turns out, are so complex or so unusual that it's difficult to believe anyone has perceived their instances in experience. But even if we restrict our attention to the other, more simple laws of logic, it should be seen that if their truth cannot be decided independently of experience, then they actually become contingent. That is, if people cannot justify the laws of logic independent of experience, then you can only say they apply as far as I know in the past experience that I've had. They are contingent, they lose their necessity, universality, and invariance. Why should a law of logic, which is verified in one domain of experience, by the way, be taken as true for unexperienced domains as well? Why should we universalize or generalize about the laws of logic, especially in a materialistic universe not subject to the control of a personal God? Now, it turns out if the a priori and the a posteriori lines of justification for logical truths are unconvincing, as I'm suggesting briefly they both are, perhaps we could say they are linguistic conventions about certain symbols. Certain philosophers have suggested that. The laws of logic would not be taken as inexorably dictated, but rather we impose their necessity on our language. They become, therefore, somewhat like rules of grammar. And as John Dewey pointed out so persuasively earlier in the century, laws of grammar, you see, are just culturally relative. If the laws of logic are like grammar, then the laws of logic are culturally relative too. Why then are not contradictory systems deemed equally rational? If the laws of logic can be made culturally relative, then we can win the debate by simply stipulating a law of logic that says anybody who argues in this way has got his tautology on his hands, and therefore it's true. Why are arbitrary conventions like the logical truths so useful if they're only conventional? Why are they so useful in dealing with problems in the world of experience? You see, we must ask whether the atheist has a rational basis for his claims. Atheists love to talk about laws of science, laws of logic. They speak as though there are certain moral absolutes for which Christians were just a few minutes ago being indicted because they didn't live up to them. But who is the atheist to tell us about laws? In a materialist universe, there are no laws, much less laws of morality that anybody has to live up to. When we consider that the lectures and essays that are written by logicians and others are not likely filled with just uninterrupted series of tautologies, we can examine those propositions which logicians are most concerned to convey. For instance, logicians will say things like a proposition has the opposite truth value from its negation. Now, when we look at those kind of propositions, we have to ask the general question, what type of evidence do people have for that kind of teaching? Is it the same sort of evidence that's utilized by the biologist, by the mathematician, the lawyer, the mechanic, by your beautician? What is it that justifies the law of logic?
or even belief that there is such a thing. What is a law of logic, after all? There's no agreement on that question. If we had universal agreement, perhaps it'd be silly to ask the question. It's been suggested to you that it's absurd to ask these sorts of things, although the analogy that was used by Dr. Stein about the absurdity of asking about the cause of the world is not at all relevant, because that isn't what my argument is. By the way, that's not absurd to ask that question either. It may be unnecessary to ask it if you're an atheist, but it's certainly not absurd to ask it. But it isn't absurd to ask the question that I'm asking about logic. You see, logicians are having a great deal of difficulty deciding on the nature of their claims. Anybody who reads in the philosophy of logic must be impressed with that today. Some say that the laws of logic are inferences comprised of judgments made up of concepts. Others say that they are arguments comprised of propositions made up of terms. Others say they are proof comprised of sentences made up of names. Others would simply say they are electrochemical processes in the brain. In the end, what you think the laws of logic are will determine the nature of evidence that you will suggest for them. Now, in an atheist universe, what are the laws of logic? How can they be universal, abstract, invariant? And how does an atheist justify the use of them? Are they merely conventions imposed on our experience, or are they something that reflect absolute truth? Dr. Stein tonight has wanted to use the laws of logic. I want to suggest to you one more time that Dr. Stein, in so doing, is borrowing my worldview. He's using the Christian approach to the world so that there can be such laws of logic, scientific inference, or what have you, but then he wants to deny the very foundation of it.
Thank you, Dr. Bonson. Dr. Stein, you now have an opportunity to cross-examine Dr. Bonson.
Well, we got about 8 minutes left, 8 or 9 minutes. And any thoughts or questions? I had a few, but I'll save mine. Yes.
Do we know why, if it's all, I guess, atheists that have the feeling that there's no need to ask about the creation of the world or the universal mother, they feel that's not important? Is that just his particular view, or is it a majority of atheists? Do we know why they feel that that's kind of an unimportant question?
I don't think anybody could say, unless you have a PhD in atheism and you've read much or all of the works of atheists, to be able to know if that is an unimportant question to ask for the majority of them.
But it seems like it's a rational question. Anybody wants
Yeah.
to know their origin. Atheists don't care, or they're trying to disprove by saying, "Oh, look over here at this hand, over here," you know? Okay.
Yeah, I would just to, I guess, psychologize for a moment. If I were an atheist, I wouldn't really find it all that important either. I mean, my concern is, as we find to be the concern in most pagans, is that they're concerned about the here and now. They don't really care a whole lot about the past. They care a bit about the future, because more than likely they'll be involved in it.
And since there's nothing beyond here now, it doesn't really matter anyway.
Sure, yeah. And I think a lot of atheists, like a lot of liberal Christians, they have fallen into they've fallen prey to the teaching of certain people who believe there's a massive gap that separates true history from our perception of history, whether our perception be based on writings or archaeological evidence. And so having an interest in knowing, they relegate history a bit in their quest to know, because it's history. It can be doubted. And I would be right there with them if I didn't know someone who told me infallibly what history entailed. I would also doubt just about every historical claim, even the existence of my own parents. Yes, Tim.
I just wanted to say the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear that is that they're also asking us to just assume with them the
Right.
material existence, their evolutionary beliefs, everything coming from nothing, and just
Leave it at that.
making that appear to be a new point,
Right.
asking us to join them in making that assumption.
And all they have to do then is put in the billions of years and say, well, from known history, everybody's had a mother, but we don't know all the known history.
Okay.
Or, as some philosophers say, matter is eternal,
Right.
and there wasn't ever a Big Bang. Susan.
If he has no basis for moral law, how can he expect Christians to be highly moral? He really can't have a basis for moral law. He can't say why someone needs to do a certain thing if he doesn't believe that there is a God, and there is a God who makes laws.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He has no basis for moral law, just like he has no basis for grammatical law.
So how can he make a statement about Christians being expected to be highly moral? How can he expect Christians to be highly moral? How can he have that expectation in his statement?
Well, I could hear him saying he can expect that given what they say about themselves and their system of thought, about God in particular. Yeah, what does God dictate as far as behavior patterns?
And that would be contradictory to his own way of thinking.
I think if he simply said, if he talked about expectations of Christians having a moral code or behaving a certain way that he likes to call moral, he's not engaging in a contradiction. But the minute he has a materialist, someone who believes that everything is matter in motion, a physicalist, whatever term you like, then he is engaging in, well, he's really speaking nonsense, because it's the statement itself doesn't comport with his view of reality, and that's the drum that Bonson's going to keep banging on, and it's the drum that we need to keep banging on when we're talking to rabid materialists like Dr. Stein. Because it does sound the death knell, I think, when you're focusing on that. Did someone else have your hand? Vernon?
Why does he take the definition of agnostic and try to say that that's atheism? And why doesn't, I guess I'm wondering, it sounds like what he's defining as atheism is
Agnosticism?
Right.
Yeah, well, Stein, and I'm sure he's appealing to, I'm sure the authors to which he appeals support his view, but it's easy to be a soft atheist or an agnostic. You don't find a lot of hard atheists who say they know that God doesn't exist because they know well enough they can't, in their system of belief, prove a universal negative or a universal positive. And so he, being somewhat educated, having experience dealing with people like us, he doesn't want to be a hard atheist because he knows it's a position he can't really defend.
So he redefines it.
Yeah. Yes, Larry.
This is a comment, and I read it in another book that I made. I have the right pages that you have. There's no obvious physical evidence of God. God wanted man to believe in him. All he'd have to do is put in an appearance, and that way anyone would believe in him except a fool. He put in an appearance in Jesus. How important is the doctrine of the deity of Christ? And then the man in hell says, well, if someone rises from the dead, now they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. So God put in appearance, and we still have atheists.
That's right.
Thousands of people who saw miracles and still didn't believe.
Right.
Oh, I would believe God made appearance. Well, you might not.
That's right.
You'd find some way to rationalize it, explain it away.
And recall the verse or passage that we looked at one point when we were discussing the fact that all evidence is theory-laden, that we all bring to the evidence that's presented to us an entire worldview, where in Matthew 28:16, the 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee, to the mountains which Jesus had designated. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some were doubtful. So here you have the disciples, the people who are with Jesus the most, viewing with their eyeballs the resurrected Christ, and they still doubt it. And it's good as Christians to point out that fact. And we can account for the doubting, can't we? Because even the followers of Christ are sinful. We can be told directly by God in a revelation, He could be right before us, do such and such, and we'll go home that night and doubt it. Probably have some stories like that in the Old Testament. Yes?
You know, I think that they die on laws of logic issue, because on another debate, we deal with the point that the gentleman who was debating, were the laws of logic before man thought of it, before man evolved, before the brain of man existed. And the gentleman, you could tell that was a question that never was presented to him before, because he paused for a long time. And then he finally, I can't remember if he answered yes or no, but if he answered yes, of course, he'd be in trouble.
Yeah.
If he answered no, then he'd be irrational. The laws of logic didn't exist before man existed, even though the universe existed billions of years before man existed.
Mm-hmm.
It's irrational. It's thoroughly irrational.
I probably said this before, but it's helpful to read, or at least listen to debates, to learn the thinking of the atheists. Because though, as I put in my note here, Dr. Stein is probably not the sharpest tool in the unbelieving shed, to adopt the phrase that we often use, he's still saying and laying out a lot of things that unbelievers, your common unbeliever, is going to set forth as a basis for doubting your worldview. And so it's really helpful in his second opening statement to hear all these things that he just throws up. My only other thought was, because we just have about a minute, is I was, maybe you took note of this, in the second opening statement by Dr. Stein, or Dr. Bonson, he followed the lead of the Apostle Paul, where in Acts 17, the Apostle Paul says to the Athenians, even as some of your own poets have said.
Right.
And notice he quoted John Dewey and John Stuart Mill, 19th and 20th century philosophers who have had an incredible impact on even some of your own thinking, though you may not know it. And so he does that because he has an example in the Apostle Paul that, even your own unbelievers are pointing out things like John Dewey did, that, language like the laws of logic, if it's just convention, we have a real problem. And that's why John Dewey was a pragmatist. And so he really eschewed epistemology altogether and said that the cash value of what we claim to know is simply that which leads to success, however you define success. So, appreciate all your attention and your staying with this perseverance. We'll finish next time and probably have a